My son had never asked to leave early from anything in his 11 years of life. Not from his cousin's birthday party when he was 6 and still in his dinosaur phase, not from the 4th of July fireworks show last summer even when it ran past midnight. Zach was the kid who always wanted to stay 5 more minutes, always the last one to put on his shoes. So when he pulled at my sleeve during the 3rd inning of the Riverton Little League Championship, a game his own best friend was pitching, and said quietly, "Dad, can we go? Please." I felt something shift in my chest that I couldn't name yet. I looked down at him. His face was turned away from the field. "You feeling sick, buddy?" "Just, can we go? I'll explain in the car." We left. I waved to my wife from across the bleachers and pointed toward the parking lot. She frowned, mouthed, "What's wrong?" and I shrugged in a way that meant I didn't know yet. Zach walked beside me with his hands jammed into his hoodie pocket, not saying anything, staring at the gravel path. We got to the truck. He climbed in. I started the engine and put it in reverse, and then I stopped. "Talk to me, bud. What's going on?" He stared at the dashboard for a long moment. Outside, I could hear the crowd cheer for something, a hit probably. The stadium lights were bright enough to cast shadows inside the cab. "Coach Bickers," he said finally. "He's been doing something." I waited. He does it after practice, when it's just some of us helping put the equipment away. He swallowed. He grabs kids, like really hard, by the arm or the shoulder, hard enough that it hurts. He laughed at Owen last week when Owen cried, said he was too soft to ever make varsity. He finally looked at me. He grabbed me like that on Thursday. He twisted my arm behind my back, and he said if I told anyone, I'd be riding the bench for the rest of the season, and if I made trouble, he'd make sure I never played in this county again. I kept my hands on the steering wheel. "Did he hurt you? Are you hurt right now?" Zach slowly pulled up his right sleeve. Even in the dim light from the parking lot, I could see the bruising on his upper arm. A dark, deliberate mark. I have thought many times since that night about what I felt in those 15 seconds. People always say rage. And there was rage, yes. A cold, specific, quiet kind that I'd never felt before. But underneath it was something worse. Guilt, the thought that came without asking. How long has this been happening and I didn't know? "How long?" I asked. "Since August," he said. "The start of fall season." 3 months. My son had been carrying this for 3 months. I pulled him across the console and held him, and he didn't pull away the way 11-year-olds usually do. He held on. "You did exactly the right thing telling me," I said. "We're going to deal with this, but first I need you to listen to me, okay? You didn't do anything wrong. Not a single thing. This is not about baseball. This has nothing to do with how good you are or whether you make varsity. You understand me?" He nodded against my shoulder. "Good. Because we're not going home yet. We need to go see a doctor tonight." My wife met us at Mercy General. I'd called her from the parking lot of the stadium before we pulled out, and by the time I told her the short version of it, her voice had gone completely flat in the way it does when she's holding herself together with both hands. She was waiting at the ER entrance when we arrived, and she hugged Zach for a long time in the sliding door entryway before anyone said another word. The intake nurse brought us back quickly. The attending physician, a quiet man named Dr. Ellsworth who had the kind of patient, unhurried manner you only develop from years of hearing hard things, examined Zach carefully and documented the bruising with photographs. He asked Zach questions in a calm, plain way, and Zach answered them. When the exam was done, Dr. Ellsworth stepped into the hallway with me. "The injury to his arm is consistent with forced restraint," he said. "Given your son's account and the nature of the bruising, I'm going to file a mandatory report with Child Protective Services and the local police department tonight." He paused. "How well known is this coach?" I told him. Coach Brendan Vickers had been running the Riverton Youth Athletic Association's baseball program for 14 years. His teams had won 3 state championships. His name was on a banner in the lobby of the rec center. The mayor had given him a commendation 2 years ago at the county fair. Dr. Ellsworth's expression didn't change. "I've seen this before," he said. "The more visible someone is in a community, the harder these cases can be to move forward. Document everything you have. Don't wait for someone else to do it." The detective who responded that night was a woman named Treat. She was professional, took careful notes, and asked Zach good questions. But when I mentioned Vickers' name, I watched her sit back slightly in her chair. "Coach Vickers," she said. "My nephew played for him 4 years ago." I said, "And?" "And he was a great coach." She seemed to hear herself and corrected. "What I mean is that this is going to require a thorough investigation. We'll need more than one account to move on someone with his standing." That phrase, his standing. I was starting to understand how much that phrase was going to cost my family. They took Zach's statement. They told us someone from the RYAA would be contacted. They told us to expect a follow-up in 3 to 5 business days. In the meantime, they said, Zach should continue attending practice as normal while the investigation was opened. I asked Pruett if she was serious. She said that removing Zach from the program abruptly could signal to Vickers that a complaint had been filed, potentially impacting the investigation. I told her my son was not going back to that field. She looked at me for a moment and wrote something down. My wife and I sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning after Zach fell asleep. I work in commercial insurance. Risk assessment is literally what I do for a living. And so I did what I do. I opened my laptop and I started building a file. I found Vickers' coaching history going back to when he'd started at the rec center. I found the commendation articles, the championship write-ups, the sponsor announcements. I also found something else, a post on a local Facebook parenting group from 2 years ago, since deleted but cached by Google. A mother asking if anyone else had noticed that her son seemed scared of the coach and had bruising after a practice he couldn't explain. The responses were what you'd expect. All kids get banged up during drills. Vickers is old school, but he gets results. Maybe your son is just sensitive. The post had 17 comments. None of them took her seriously. I didn't know who she was, but I wrote down the date and as much of the cache text as I could copy. I started calling other parents the next day. I was careful about it. I wasn't going to burn a potential investigation by running my mouth. But I'd known some of these families for 3 seasons. I asked how their kids were doing, whether they'd noticed any changes this fall, whether anything felt off. Most of them said no. 3 of them hesitated. One mother, she had a son named Freddie who played second base, told me that Freddie had started faking stomach aches on practice days, that when she asked him why, he said Coach Vickers yells too much. She had assumed it was just nerves about the championship. She hadn't pushed it. A father whose son played outfield told me his boy had quit the team in September, which surprised everyone because he was one of the better players. He said his son told him he just didn't want to play anymore. He accepted it. He wished now that he'd asked more questions. And a woman I'll call Sandra, I won't use her real name because she asked me not to even now, told me that her son had come home from a practice in late October with a black eye that he said came from a wild throw during drills. She had believed him, but she told me that when she signed his permission slip for the championship game that weekend, he had started crying and said he didn't want to go. She had thought it was performance anxiety. She had made him go anyway. She started crying on the phone when she told me that part. I documented every conversation with the date, the name, what was said. I kept 3 copies, one on my computer, one on a thumb drive, one printed, and in a folder in my truck. The 5 business days came and went. I called Truett. She told me the investigation was ongoing and that they had spoken with Coach Vickers, who categorically denied the allegations and stated that Zach had a history of behavioral issues during practices that had been noted in his coaching records. I asked to see those records. She told me that wasn't how it worked. I asked whether any other families had been contacted. She said she couldn't share details of an active investigation. I hung up and drove to the rec center. I didn't go to Vickers. I went to find the woman who'd been running the front desk at the RYA for as long as I could remember. A retired school teacher named Mrs. Delaney who knew every kid in that program by name and always kept butterscotch candies in a dish on her desk. I had talked to her dozens of times over 3 seasons of pickups and drop-offs. I asked if I could speak with her privately. We sat in the break room. "I've heard something happened," she said before I could start. "Word travels in a place like this." "Then you know what I'm here about." She folded her hands on the table. She was quiet for a moment in the way that told me she was choosing something. "I've worked here 11 years, she said. "I've seen a lot of coaches come and go. Brendan Vickers brings in more registrations, more sponsorships, more state titles than anyone this program has ever had." She paused. "And I've had 3 boys pull me aside over the years asking me if they could call their mums early. I filed incident reports each time. I don't know what happened to them." I asked if she would show me what she filed. "I can't show you records that aren't yours." She looked at me steadily. "But if someone filed a public records request with the County Parks Department, which oversees this facility, any documented incident reports from the last 10 years would be subject to disclosure. The form is on the county website." I filed the request that afternoon. While I waited, I did something I'm not entirely proud of, but I would do again without hesitation. I borrowed a dashcam from my brother-in-law, the wide-angle kind with the long battery life, and I positioned it inside my car in the rec center parking lot on a practice day, aimed at the side entrance where the equipment shed was. I wasn't trespassing. I was parked on public property. On the second day, I got footage. I won't describe it in detail because part of it involved minors, and it was entered into evidence. But what I saw on that footage was a coach who behaved one way in front of a full field, and a completely different way when it was 4 or 5 kids and the rest of the parents had driven away. The body language, the way he got in close, the way kids flinched. The public records request came back 9 days later. 3 incident reports filed by RYA staff over 7 years. Each one had been reviewed by the program director, a man named Hollis Geary who had been Vickers' teammate in college. Each one had been closed without further action, citing insufficient specificity. I now had the medical documentation, my son's formal statement, the dashcam footage, 3 parent accounts, 3 buried incident reports, and a cached social media post. My wife and I had talked about going back to the police, but we had also talked to a friend of ours who practices family law, and she had been straightforward with us. In cases involving well-connected community figures, investigations often stall, not because of lack of evidence, but because of lack of pressure. The pressure, she said, had to come from somewhere. The RYA held a mandatory parent information night every November. It was technically open to the public. It was 4 days away. I called Sandra and the mother with the son named Freddie and the father whose kid had quit in September. I told them what I had. I asked them if they were willing to stand up in their room with me. Sandra said yes immediately. The other mother said she needed a night to think. She called back at 7 in the morning and said yes. The father said he didn't want to make trouble. I told him he didn't have to speak. I just asked him to show up and sit in that room, so Vickers could see that it wasn't just one family making noise. He showed up. The meeting was held in the main gymnasium. Folding chairs, fluorescent lighting, a podium at the front. Vickers was there, sitting with a program director, Hollis Geary, in the front row, looking, I remember thinking, exactly like a man who had no reason to be worried. 14 years of no reason to be worried. When the public comment period opened, I walked to the microphone. I didn't raise my voice. I have found, in 11 years of negotiating insurance claims, that the quieter you speak when you're angry, the more people listen. I said my name. I said my son's name. I said what had happened to him, and when. And I said that it had not happened in isolation. And I said that there were filed incident reports from this very organization dating back 7 years that had been reviewed and closed by a man who had a personal relationship with the accused. I said I had medical documentation, a formal police report, and footage from a parking lot camera that had been submitted to an attorney. Then I placed a folder of copies on the table in front of the RYAA board. The room erupted the way rooms do when something that has been sitting in the walls for a long time finally gets said out loud. Geary tried to interrupt me. Vickers stood up and said the word baseless twice. A woman in the back row I didn't recognize started crying. 2 other mothers stood up and began speaking without waiting to be called on. One of them said her son had told her in September that Coach Vickers made kids do push-ups until they threw up as punishment for missed catches, and that when her son had started crying, Vickers had told him in front of the whole team that crybabies don't make champions. She had told her son to toughen up. She said it with her hand over her mouth like she was trying to take the words back. The board chair called a recess. When they came back 30 minutes later, Vickers had been asked to leave the building. The board announced that Vickers was being placed on administrative suspension pending an external review. They also announced that Hollis Geary would be stepping aside from the review process due to his personal connection to the case. That wasn't enough, but it was a beginning. Dr. Pruitt called me the following morning. Her voice was different. "We've received 4 additional formal complaints in the last 18 hours, she said. "We're opening a full criminal investigation. I need you to come in and bring everything you have." "I've had everything ready for 2 weeks," I said. "I know." A pause. "Mr. Webb, I owe you an apology. When you first came in, I let his reputation do work it shouldn't have done. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." I told her I appreciated that. I meant it. I also told her I needed it in writing. The search warrant was executed 4 days later. I won't go into what investigators found on his office computer and in his locked desk drawer because most of it is still part of the court record. But I will say that what they found made it clear that what had happened to Zach and the others was not impulsive. It was deliberate. It was patterned. Vickers had been specifically identifying kids he believed were less likely to be believed. Boys whose fathers weren't involved. Boys who struggled in school. Boys who had already been labeled as difficult. He kept notes. Actual written notes about which kids were most manageable. When they arrested him on a Tuesday morning in December, the local news covered it. I sat in the car in our driveway and watched the clip on my phone. Zach was at school. My wife was on a call. I watched it alone, and I didn't feel what I expected to feel. No relief yet, just the specific exhausted weight of knowing how long it had gone on. 7 families came forward in the weeks that followed. The total count of identified incidents stretched back 9 years. The trial took 8 months. Vickers' defense attorney did what defense attorneys do in cases like this, suggested that the boys had coordinated their stories, that I had coached my son's testimony, that the dash cam footage was ambiguous. He used the word overzealous about me twice. I sat in that courtroom every day my work schedule allowed, and I watched the evidence be entered piece by piece. And I watched 12 people on a jury listen to 7 boys describe the same man doing the same things in the same place over nearly a decade. Vickers was convicted on 11 of 13 counts, sentenced to 19 years. Hollis Geary resigned from the REAA. An independent audit of the organization's incident reporting process revealed that 2 additional complaints, beyond the 3 I had found through the public records request, had been filed and never logged at all. The County Parks Department mandated a complete restructuring of the program's oversight protocols. Background checks were expanded. An anonymous reporting line was created for kids and parents. Mrs. Delaney was not fired. She was, as far as I know, still at that front desk the last time I checked. I like to think she chose the right moment. Zach started working with a therapist in January, a man who specialized in sports-related trauma and who had a dry sense of humor that Zach responded to immediately. The first few months were hard in the way the therapist had told us they would be. Zach had nightmares. He didn't want to be in situations where an adult male was in charge of a group of kids. He dropped baseball entirely and, for a while, didn't want to do any organized sports at all, which was hard to watch in a kid who had lived and breathed it. But by the following spring, he had started going to the batting cages again. Just for himself, no team, no coach watching. Just him and the machine and the sound of the ball. And one afternoon he came home and said he thought he might want to try a new league in the fall, in the next town over, somewhere that didn't have that parking lot and that equipment shed in his memory. He played fall season. He wasn't the same kid on the field. Quieter, more watchful, less likely to dive for something risky. But he played, and one game, toward the end of the season, he hit a double in the 7th inning that brought in 2 runs. And I watched him round first and pull up at second base with his hand on his knee, and a small, private smile on his face that had nothing to do with anyone watching. I had to look away for a second. Not because I was sad, because I was so grateful I didn't know what to do with it. There are things I know now that I didn't know 2 years ago. I know that my son had been trying to protect me from being upset. He had told me later, in a session with his therapist that I was allowed to sit in on, that he had almost told me 3 different times before the championship game, but that each time he thought about what Vickers had said, "No one will believe you, and if you make trouble, I'll make sure you never play again." He stopped. He believed it. He genuinely believed that the coach's word would carry more weight than his. That part has stayed with me more than anything else. We spend so much time telling kids to speak up, but we don't always build the conditions where they believe it will actually work. They see who gets believed and who doesn't. They watch adults defer to titles and trophies and years of service. They learn very quickly that the deck is stacked. My son was 11 years old and he had already done that math. So when people ask me what I tell other parents, I don't start with "believe your kids though you should." I start with this: make sure your kids know, in a specific and repeated way, that you will burn things down for them if you have to, not in a frightening way. In a steady way. The way you tell a kid you'll always come pick them up no matter what time it is and no matter what they did. You mean it, and they know you mean it, so they call. Zach finally told me because somewhere underneath all of it, he believed that I would act, that I wouldn't freeze, that I wouldn't weigh his word against Vickers' trophies and find his word wanting. I think about the boys who had no one to call, the ones who grew up and moved away and maybe never told anyone. I think about them a lot. My wife and I got involved with a county coalition that advocates for better oversight of youth sports programs. It is slow, unglamorous work. It involves a lot of meetings in church fellowship halls and a lot of strongly worded emails to county commissioners who respond 6 weeks late. It involves being the annoying parents who show up to every RYA board meeting even now, 2 years after it's over, just to make sure the new protocols are actually being followed. We do it because Zach asked us to. He found out we'd gotten involved and he asked us to keep going. He said he didn't want what happened to him to be just something that happened to him. He wanted it to matter for somebody else too. He's 13 now. He made JV at his new school this spring. His coach is a woman named Coach Rutherford who runs a tight practice and is hard on fundamentals and who also, Zach tells me, always makes sure there's at least 2 adults present when they're breaking down equipment after games. He noticed that. He told me about it like he was reporting something important. Because he understood at 13 that it was. There is a letter in my desk drawer from the mother of one of the other boys. A kid who had been in Vickers' program 3 years before Zach, who is now 16 and who testified during the trial. His mother wrote to tell me that her son, who had refused to talk about what had happened for nearly 2 years, had watched the verdict on his phone in his bedroom, and then come downstairs and told her the whole story for the first time. She wrote, "He said he could finally say it out loud because he knew it was true now. Because people had believed the other boys, he knew they would have believed him too. You gave him that." I have read that letter more times than I can count. Not because it makes what happened smaller. Nothing will do that. But because it reminds me why every terrible meeting, every unreturned call, every moment of sitting in a courtroom listening to a defense attorney call my son's account inconsistent, why all of it was the only option. There is no version of this story where I stood down. Not after I saw that bruise. Not after my son looked at me in that truck and asked me with his eyes if I was going to be the kind of father who fought back. I hope I answered the question the right way. I think I did. The thing I keep coming back to isn't the verdict. It isn't even the moment Vickers was led out of that courtroom. It's a much smaller moment. Zach in the truck, in the dark, rolling up his sleeve. That took more courage than anything I did in the 14 months that followed. I had lawyers, public records law, a dash cam, a paper trail. He had nothing except a shaky decision to trust me. And I've thought a lot about why he finally did. Not the night of the championship game specifically, but why it was me he told. I'd like to think it was because of something I'd done right as a father, but honestly I think it was simpler than that. He believed, in the back of his mind, that I would do something. Not that I would feel something. Kids know their parents feel things. He believed I would act. That belief was the whole thing. Without it, he stays quiet. The bruises fade. Vickers keeps coaching. What I've realized is that believing your children isn't just an emotional posture. It's a decision you make before anything happens. It's the repeated, boring, daily practice of listening when they tell you small things, so that when a large thing comes, they already know the answer to the question they're really asking, which is, will you choose me over your own comfort? Zach had watched me for 11 years. He had his answer. Every parent who loses that moment with their kid probably lost it long before the moment came, in 100 small ways they never noticed. I also know now that good intentions without clear thinking are not enough. When Detective Pruitt first sat across from me and let Vickers' reputation do the work of an alibi, she wasn't malicious. She was just doing what most people do. She was pattern matching. Trusted community figure plus single upset parent equals he said, she said. I had to break that pattern with documentation so organized and thorough that there was no comfortable place for doubt to live. Rage doesn't do that. Evidence does, knowing how systems work, how they can be forced, pressured, exposed through public records requests and parking lot cameras and county board meetings. That's what moved this case. I am grateful every day that I had the kind of work background that gave me those tools. I think about the parents who don't have them. And that's why I'm still sitting in those fellowship hall meetings 2 years later. And then there's the part that's hardest to talk about, which is the sustained will to keep going when every reasonable person around you is telling you to let the process work and be patient. There were 3 separate moments in this where I almost stopped pushing, where I told myself that I'd done what I could and that the system would take it from there. I didn't stop, but the temptation was real. What got me through it wasn't anger. Anger burns fast. It was something steadier than that. It was the image of my son in that truck, having carried something alone for 3 months because he thought no one would believe him. That image didn't get easier with time. I used it. Zach is 13 now and he's going to be okay. I know that with more certainty than I've known most things. Not because what happened to him didn't matter, but because he saw what happens when someone decides it matters enough to fight. He carries that. It's part of him now in a way that the bad part isn't, or at least not only. I hope that's enough. I think it is.